Hello all, I'll be introducing Dr. Rochelle Pinto. So Dr. Rochelle Pinto is a print historian whose work covers the multi-regional and multilingual print histories of Goa. Her main areas of interest are 19th century land ownership and the relationship between ethnography and the colonial novel, particularly in the context of colonial Goa. Her first monograph, Between Empires, Print and Politics in Goa, explores the role of the print world in the creation of Goan identity under Portuguese rule. She has co-directed a 2-year project, Archives and Access, with the former colleague, Aparna Balachandran, to create a directory of archives in different parts of the country. As a component of the project, she has curated a blog which encourages researchers to write a short account of the libraries and archives they have used. More recently, she has, in her words, entered into a vivid and garrulous conversation with an archive comprising of Konkani print that straddles several archives and scripts, and which informs her latest work, Translation Script and Orality, Becoming a Language of State. Dr. Pinto has taught at the Center for the Study of Culture and Society in Bangalore and at Delhi University, and was previously a research fellow at l'Institut d'études avancées, NAT, and the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi. On behalf of the students and faculty here at Krea University, I would like to thank Dr. Pinto.
Thank you, Madhura. Rochelle, all yours.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Joya in particular and Krea for inviting me to address the class on translation studies and for the opportunity to speak about my new book, Translation Script and Orality. I hope everyone's recovered fully from COVID since the last time this was scheduled. And thank you once again for making time. I'm sure you're overburdened with classes. So with that, let me start. I'm just going to share my screen. So the title of this presentation promises quite a lot, and I hope to be able to address some of its implications. I selected it because it identified a core assumption which underpins literary history as a practice and as a naturalized idea of the literary past. And this is the idea of continuity, which merges literature and language and presumes a linear movement from oral traditions to writing. Now, the links between this notion of continuity and literary or linguistic continuity and translation are not immediately apparent. But the sphere of Konkani translations made the links quite visible to me, and I hope to describe them in the talk today. As you know, as students of translation studies, it's an argument that you're probably familiar with is that there's no literary text and no translation that's autonomous of perspectives through which it is received, whether these concern language, literature, literary history, or concepts of civilization in their entirety. So we know that any translated text invariably inserts itself and leans on some of these categories and some of these assumptions. But despite knowing this, I was struck by the degree to which, far beyond any engagement with the literary work itself, translations in Konkani were overwhelmingly shaped by the compulsion to produce a suitable language. So the translated text in itself would embody a linguistic and literary exemplar for the future. But often, the text was not of central interest in the commentaries that preceded it. And this was a pattern that I saw over and over again. So the corrective impulse to produce a suitable language expectedly was a phenomenon of the 19th century, which continued into the late 20th. The reason was that Konkani in almost all its dimensions fell short of being the kind of modular language required by nationalist philology. And yet I found that by the mid-20th century, it had begun to acquire attributes of cultural dominance that eventually secured state recognition. So the study therefore revealed a shift over a century in scholarly perspectives, which virtually evacuated the language before endowing it with recognizable signs of cultural dominance. So it seemed like quite an extreme case. Though, of course, this experience of confrontation with nationalist philology is something that is a familiar narrative, I think, across the subcontinent. So at the level of the historical, there is an explanation for this phenomenon. in the late 19th century, Konkani was adopted by the Saraswat Brahmins of Goa as a sign of their cultural distinctiveness. So this helped them carve out an identity that was defined against other Brahmin groups on the West Coast, particularly the Chitpavan Brahmins. So this intra-Brahmin identity struggle had carried on for centuries, and the adoption of language as a symbol of distinction happened only in the late 19th century, but it meant that Konkani from that time on had the backing of an upper caste literati, both Catholic and Hindu. So this is a simple enough narrative of how Konkani moved by recent times, I mean in modern times, from being considered a dialect without a literary history to a state language. What is bewildering, however, is how difficult it is to narrate a literary history through the structures that we've come to expect of literary histories, that they begin with the first appearance of a written or a printed text, and we organize genres and authors and movements chronologically from that point. Literary histories tend to explain discontinuities and issues with the language. And in the commentaries and introductions preceding translations of Konkani texts, which is the focus of my work, every dimension of the language seemed to be problematic until it had been purged and reworked. So the ways in which Konkani was found wanting helped to reconstruct the demands of nationalist philology. So while the narrative of what nationalist philology does is familiar, the reason why I thought this was a remarkable instance was that the ways in which Konkani fell short of the demands of philology actually revealed more about philology than one was aware of. So my talk therefore begins by focusing on the ways in which the language was marked as a deficit, because these points of deficit foreground principles of modern philology that are naturalized as the given attributes of any language. So this work actually helped me denaturalize some of those assumptions, which kind of take for granted because if you're inserted into a sort of dominant literary history. So to begin with some brief aspects about the Konkani language, it is spoken down the western coast of India. And each of these communities that speak the language is housed in different states that have other Indian languages as their official language, all except the state of Goa, where Konkani is the official language. I'll just go back to the presentation at this point. Here. So I initially detailed those aspects of the linguistic existence of Konkani that have been the focus of what I call translation reform. And I then moved to suggesting how we may develop literary studies, right, of literary studies of the text that seem to deviate from what had been philologically approved of. So in the Indian context, literary history has had to contend with not just the hierarchy between colonial and indigenous languages. Is there an issue? Someone has their hand up, Alia.
Alia?
Sorry.
Okay. In the Indian context, literary history had to contend with not just the hierarchy between colonial and indigenous languages, but a normative cultural majoritarianism that also sharply hierarchized cultural practices, whether literature or language, in the service of nationalism. My focus on philology, however, and the reason I distributed an excerpt from Siraj Ahmed's work, is to emphasize that while we know that the state's literary imagination is shaped broadly by Orientalist and upper caste symbols, these political and historical imperatives work in conjunction with the naturalized conception of language. Underlying epistemic assumptions are apparent in the philological demand on literary history. So from the late 19th century on, the conjunction of philology and nationalism produced the idea of continuous linear histories that present territory, community, and writing as symmetrical and overlapping concepts. While the idea of continuous literary history may seem neutral enough, as the appearance of one text after another, we know that this is necessarily about writing. And as we will see, only certain kinds of writing become acceptable for inclusion. So languages were hierarchized in relation to each other, identified with the territory, and the evidence of writing in antiquity endowed some literatures and the communities associated with them with the valued attribute of a long history. The 18th century philological model of a tree or a map through which comparative assessments of languages could be made subsequently affected other fields of study and of cultural analysis, such as ethnology. The historicity of language, which is the ability to attach a continuous past to each language, was a fundamental component of modern philological analysis. To such assumptions about language, the legacy of Indology and Orientalism added classicism as a cultural value, and the appearance of epic texts became a point of civilizational origin. Another influential concept is the idea of language as singular individuated entities, each separate from the other, with an evolutionary history that implied development over time from speech to writing and from simple to complex forms. Flowing from this, to return to how these principles appear in historical and political actions, cultural nationalism attached ancient languages to contemporary communities apparently seamlessly. This positions Sanskrit and the foundational epics associated with it as a normative beginning for all literary history in India. The self-narrative of upper caste, thus, was naturalized to that of the nation. Literary organizations transform such expectations not only into a cultural model, but a condition for languages to be able to earn official recognition. So language communities were expected to provide evidence of literary texts from antiquity, and in fulfillment of the dual expectation that defines literary modernity, they had to demonstrate their capacity to furnish concepts for the future. So in each instance, therefore, we see how an epistemological expectation translates into practice. So the privileging of Sanskrit as a point of origin has created what appear to be abstract universal expectations of literary history in India, which are in fact modeled on dominant histories of Sanskrit. Sheldon Pollock has drawn attention, for instance, to two moments in the history of writing: the moment when a language is written, its literization, and literarization when it is used in a literary text. This is also the time a language is named, he notes, as an objective entity. In the light of these philological universals, which have been detailed in many texts, particularly since the 1980s, I move to the next section, in which I discuss two instances of Konkani textual production that was simultaneously claimed for literary history and purged of unwelcome usages through translation. In both instances, the texts concerned were seen as valuable components within literary history, but only if they could be sufficiently modified. So though it does appear in inscriptions some centuries earlier, to borrow a criterion for written languages from Sheldon Pollock's work, Konkani appeared as the dominant language of a literary text in the 16th century and became a print language in the 17th. It has the unforgivable history of having acquired distinction as a written and literary language through the mediation of missionaries and in the Roman script. A strategy employed by missionaries at the time was to master the cultural codes of a community so that they could graft doctrinal texts by reproducing genres, scripts, verse forms, and narrative patterns. So just to give you an instance of this, right. So the Christian texts, which were modeled on existing devotional forms to install new concepts and challenge and destroy existing ones, therefore unquestionably had cultural authority and constituted a recognizable Christian high and lay tradition, as they drew on prevalent cultural practices and indigenized Latin ones. So this is the Doctrina Christa, which was published in 1622 in Konkani, but you also have the production of the Christa Purana, which is a Marathi text. And through the title itself, you can tell that obviously this draws on the Purana form, right? So that's what I meant when I was talking about how Christian texts were both modeled on existing devotional forms and the indigenized Latin ones. The second instance that is important for this discussion of philology is the discovery in the mid-20th century of 16th century Konkani and Marathi manuscripts of excerpts from the Ramayana and Mahabharata in a library in Portugal. This discovery set off two different kinds of reactions. The manuscripts or codices were in the Roman script and had probably been transliterated with the mediation of the Portuguese by a range of scribes from oral recitations. These codices became the gateway to a legitimate claim on cultural nationalism and state recognition, as they promised a link to a pan-regional culture. They were the earliest signs of a literary culture preceding and enabling the production of Christian literature. This history, however, was seen as constitutively corrupted by its Christian agents and by the Roman script. The value attributed to antiquity ensured these manuscripts a significant place within literary history, but only as oral texts whose transition into writing was never complete. They were valuable as evidence of pre-16th century Konkani that remained to be restored to the contemporary through translation. The discomfort with the Roman script was so comprehensive, and the perceived cultural distance between the Roman and the Devnagari script was so great that I use the term translation as an umbrella term for transcriptions. I also use it to describe the desire to replace contemporary Konkani with an ideal conception of it that lay in the past. Different scholars identify different points in the literary past from which they would recover the language, and this is why I use the term corrective translation or translation reform. The language used in the 16th century Mahabharata and Ramayana had to be salvaged from its script and restored to the moment when it was transliterated, a moment that was as yet untouched by colonial influence. We find a parallel, though different, concern with regard to 20th century republications of the 17th century Dutrina, which was in the previous slide. Oops, sorry. Yep. Okay. So in the case of the Christian doctrinal text, the Dutrina intended for daily use, the fear was that oral practices, grammatical errors, and loan words from other languages had corrupted the text. So unlike the Ramayana and Mahabharata, which had to be restored from the point prior to which it had been transliterated, in the case of the Dutrina, which had circulated and was a popular sort of devotional text, the fear was that it had been corrupted through oral use. The translation back to different versions of 16th century Konkani was thus the way forward for the community. From the perspective of nationalist philology, however, the moment when the language was committed to writing in the Roman script was also the point when it was alienated from itself. So these are the instances of what I referred to when I said that the idea of a linear history does not easily accommodate this variation in script or in textual form and in the discursive context within which texts were produced. The Roman script interrupted the 19th century desire for a single community and a single language. This is not a unique story, as most literary histories are not naturally structured in a manner that earns state recognition. Konkani, however, is an instance of a language that had to be purged of its script, its association with missionaries, its borrowings from Portuguese, in some instances from Persian and Arabic, and even of its appearance in colloquial popular 19th century publications. Lastly, even when not in Roman, the multiplicity of scripts used for Konkani were also a challenge to the attempt to present a singular linguistic community. I move now to a question that arises when confronted with such deviations from literary history. What are the categories that can capture the relationship to language that such texts exhibit? The kind of relationship that makes them an uncomfortable fit within literary history. Within the book, to attempt a conversation that was not rooted entirely through dominant national literary models, I attempted to draw some parallels with other languages that use the Roman script. Other literary cultures within the subcontinent that use the script are those of the Khasi language, various languages of Naga tribal groups, Santali and Mizo. In some instances, versions of the Roman script or orthography had become symbols of identity assertion. Whereas in the case of Santali, both Roman and Devnagari were opposed by some sections to assert autonomy from Christian and statist discourses, and the Old Chiki script had found acceptance. So therefore, where a composite majoritarian cultural model was absent, the Roman script was not especially problematized. There is also evidently no necessary similarity across literary cultures that deviate from the national model. Instead, I think the challenge is to develop frameworks around the spatializing of literary regions or the importance of geographic constructs that can make visible literary processes that a conventional history does not. So for instance, in the book, I cite a study of Assam by Manjeet Barua that highlights how geographic regions, such as the one extending from Myanmar to the valley, carried distinct cultural and temporal attributes in literary writing, as opposed to the Gangetic culture, which philological nationalism established as the dominant cultural model, and which subsequently became the singular way to organize literary space and time. This does not reveal commonalities between Goa and Assam. Further, similar spatialized myths on the Western coast, like the Parshuram myth, that circulate in the literary culture of Goa are not socially subversive, but legitimize state and upper caste power. In fact, a comparative study most often reveals the vastly different literary imaginations at work. And this is therefore just an initial step towards a conversation that does not mark such histories as a deficit from the dominant order. Aside from touching on other uses of the Roman script, I also examined popular Konkani texts, which were rejected not only because they were written in the Roman script, but because of their colloquial usages. Aside from valorizing these because they appear to represent a non-elite worldview, the challenge was to trace whether there was a relationship to language that was different from literary texts that were more recognizable by nationalist philology. There was a surge in popular Konkani printed texts in the Roman script in the 19th century, and because of their irregular spellings and colloquial usages, they called forth a very sharp critique from the Catholic elite. This phenomenon, once again, is common to many other literary spheres. So rather than approach popular print only as a form of political expression or literary aspiration, I found Bourdieu's conception of habitus a useful one, because it addressed the relationship to language that we see in popular texts. I focus on the definition of habitus because, unlike modern philology, these texts retain elements of an oral culture in which language is not a neutral vehicle of representation. Instead, the community encountered modernity by claiming language as their familiar, something they could wrap around themselves as they were introduced to a new migrant world. Bourdieu conceived of habitus as those unspoken dispositions collectively shared by all members of the group, so that individually and across space and time, they produced similar practices. It was a combination of practice as well as judgments and categories, and together produced the represented social world, the lifestyle that characterized a group. Thus, habitus was different from law, as it could regulate society without an express call to order. It was not solely regulatory, as it made improvisation possible. The distribution of objects within a house, for instance, Bourdieu stated, is habitus at its freest, or one could say least self-conscious. This conception encapsulates Konkani usages and texts that may have been didactic, critical, or instructive, as they coaxed readers towards emotive states that would accustom them to new economic and temporal structures. The concept makes visible tones of address that drew from oral interactions and the movement of literary content and style between what was familiar and what was new. It was these aspects that extended the habitus of Konkani so that its speakers and readers could find their place in relation to the demands of modernity without surrendering or breaking from the limits of a moral society. This perspective offered analytical tools to identify literary and linguistic strategies in popular print, irrespective of the actual social origins of their writers. As habitus, language continued to be a lived practice and was not separated as a distinct object from other dimensions of the social world. Bourdieu differentiated, for instance, between the standpoint of someone listening to or studying a language and a speaker who used language as a means of action and expression. So language was not the mere execution of an overarching logic, but a practice that extended and renewed the habitus, especially in times of change. I would like to go back to sharing the screen at this point. Yeah. So this illuminates an important distinction between the vocabularies and dictionaries produced by linguists and literary scholars and those that were written specifically for Goan migrants who needed to expand their vocabularies rapidly as their employment took them into alien kitchens, steamships, factories, and homes. Vocabularies and dictionaries that signified travel had limited lists of words, often pertaining to particular professions, and were meant to facilitate transition to employment outside the home. Such vocabularies would have been used by those who were literate, but who were probably closer to an oral culture. Walter Ong, the theorist of oral culture, states, oral cultures, of course, have no dictionaries and few semantic discrepancies. Or he says, an oral culture has no vehicle as neutral as a list. These aphoristic statements draw attention to the fact that these vocabularies were publications whose relevance was contingent on their immediate use. They did not present themselves as representations of language as a whole, but as an aid to the subset of language that a user would need. Ong's formulations of oral cultures continue to be the most sensitive to such linguistic worlds. He notes the tendency to situational rather than categorical thinking in oral cultures that do not manifest a context-free or autonomous written discourse detached from the author. Cross-referenced vocabularies, on the other hand, drew on historical usages and authoritative texts of the past. Whereas in contrast, the vocabulary in 5 languages, in English, Portuguese, Konkani, Marathi, and Urdu, produced in 1878, carried entries for numbers, collective nouns, trees, clothes, and things pertaining to the universe and land. While the Manual de 3.000 Vocabulos of 1892 had lists of food, drinks, and table service, which those employed in kitchens might use. Each genre of popular print, therefore, allowed for an unfolding of a dimension of life in a new social world. A guide to secret signals and romantic signs suggested how romance could be conducted across the balconies of Bombay apartments. A letter-writing guide taught a migrant son to ask for tobacco to be sent from home and to apply for a job. Pedro Dias's The Goan Cook's Guide of 1894 combined the vocabulary with the cookbook. Its select vocabulary in English, French, Hindustani, and Konkani, along with interest tables, salary charts, glossaries, and menus, would allow Goan cooks to gain a grip on exactly those words, measures, and meanings they would need in the course of their daily work. So recipes in Konkani for the half-pay pudding, conservative pudding, Nurse Hannah's pudding, and mysterious pudding translated culturally distinct objects and processes across languages. These least studied texts, the Swahili Gujarati language primers or Konkani Swahili vocabularies produced at the turn of the 19th century, not only chart the objects and occupations that constituted a transition from an oral culture, but they signal the zone of contact languages in which migrants across class and community had to acquire new language equivalences rapidly, whether as civil servants, shopkeepers, or construction workers. For this reason, rather than exclusively mapping popular linguistic production to class location, the concept of habitus allows literary strategies to acquire definition. For instance, Konkani speakers rejected the imperative to change their political stances and their grammar when the demand originated from outside the habitus, from the world of formal linguists and scholars. However, the same critiques of orthography and grammar were accepted when articulated as a shared community practice that would facilitate social advancement. There are other political strategies that come to light in these texts. Newspapers and books self-consciously refer to themselves and to other forms of print. Their advertisements addressed readers as though they were male relatives, as male kin. They had the intense colloquial vigor of a public political language that simulated a relationship with the state and with the Portuguese-speaking elite, knowing that they were scarcely heard. Speech patterns were directed inward into the community through the use of possessive pronouns and colloquialisms, while they simultaneously performed an outward public political discourse. These elements in popular print make the use of the concept of habitus a compelling choice. I turn now to adaptations. Adaptations, as is well known in translation studies in the context of India since the 80s perhaps, adaptations were often termed translations. And in many popular texts, the fact that they were derived from a prior text was not foregrounded beyond the titles. A tendency to use the proper name of a historical figure or text, but populate it with local material, could be viewed as a textual tradition in India that extends from the Ramayana to other texts. But rather than claim tenuous continuities, it could also be seen as a strategy for a minor literary practice to introduce canonical ideas and names, while merging its world with the unknown. Books titled Napoleon Bonaparte or Julius Caesar adapted stories about these figures to comment on contemporary Goa and its history, to assess the political values that these historical figures represented against the situation of ordinary people. This strategy internalized a hierarchical relationship to prominent personalities and texts, but made this hierarchy habitable by peopling it with the familiar. Stowaway literature of this sort was a strategy employed to negotiate textual hierarchy even within the community. In a novel about a village landlord, while the main plot described his birth and life, as though it could not but concern itself with an important figure, the intervening chapters alluded to objects and temporal experiences that in fact belonged to the impecunious migrant. So the temporal categories and the memories that were important to the migrant feature as prose accounts in the middle of the novel, as though the genre could not be fully inhabited by a migrant life, but could only be accommodated around the life of a landlord. Other kinds of stowaway literature were stories about the demise of monarchies and aristocracies. These enacted and legitimized the rise of protagonists through individual effort separated from circumstances of birth. We'll go back. Sorry. So they incorporated the dominant conception of an idealized ancient past and Brahminical geographies of origin, but eventually populated the text with details of wedding rituals and contemporary medical practices, which don't seem to fit the main concern of the books, but were all concerns of the migrant going away from home. I'll just stop here. Right. So a third aspect to popular Konkani literature is its multilingual feature. However, recent challenges to philology suggest that multilingualism is not restricted to popular writing. Siraj Ahmed, for instance, argues that canonical texts that we imagine are written exclusively in Sanskrit, in fact contained Prakrit usages, making them multilingual. As the name Sanskrit in itself denotes refinement or artificiality, by implication, he argues, it suggests a language that followed, or at least was simultaneous with one that was deemed natural. This perspective of linguistic worlds as always necessarily multilingual throws light on one 19th century translated text, the Qissas al-Anbiya. A history of the saints from Adam, a rare sign of the presence of Islamic culture in the 19th century history of Konkani print. This text, which was printed in Bombay, was listed in a British library catalogue and described as a translation into Konkani and was written by Qazi Qutbuddin. The catalogue entry, which is all I had for several years, the catalogue entry added that it was written in Sindhi characters. The curator for South Asia confirmed that it was written in the Nusk or the Nastaliq typeface, which is used for Arabic, Sindhi, Urdu, and other languages, and that the content relied heavily on Arabic and Persian terminology with possible Sindhi usages. Though this is the only instance I have of Konkani in this script from this time, aspects of this publication typify the nature of literary production in this sphere. Excuse me. Bi or trilingual texts such as the Qissas sorry, let me mute this for a moment. Okay. Bi or trilingual texts, such as the Kissa Salanbia, had a wide circulation and appeared in a range of genres. The curator elaborated that the introductory paragraph said, "The author has translated the work into Konkani," and I'm quoting here from her translation from the book. "The author has translated the work into Konkani so that it will be useful to Konkani-speaking Muslims seeking religious guidance." He specifically mentions female Muslims as the target audience, in addition to Muslim men. While Muslimin wa Muslimat is a Quranic phrase that often gets repeated in Islamic religious discourse, she said, its use here seems to be deliberate, with a view to including female readers in the audience. If, as the curator suggested, the Qissas al-Anbiya did in fact particularly mention women, had Konkani and Nastaliq become part of the habitus of devotional reading or recitation in domestic contexts on the western coast of India, the fact that the book was printed in Bombay along with its Sindhi usages points to a zone of circulation extending across the Indian Ocean. Perhaps the unremarked on transition between Konkani, Sindhi, Arabic, and Persian that the Qissas al-Anbiya demonstrates is an aspect of linguistic existence and literary possibility that minor cultures demonstrate. Bi or trilingual texts were a response to contexts of trade, ecumenism, and labor that brought people into contact with each other. They help us sidestep the compulsion to tell singular literary histories and to divide the world of writing and speech into successive temporal intervals. So while such approaches help us depart from the constraints of philologically determined literary histories, this does not suggest that the world of transitional orality and multilinguality was necessarily freer or progressive. Popular Konkani newspapers represented select neighborhoods in the city of Bombay, populated by Goan Catholic migrants, spatially and socially. They both enabled and contained the encounter with the unfamiliar by restricting the horizon of moral and cosmological reference to a rural Catholic worldview that was punitive of migrant women. For a period of time, it allowed for the participation of readers across castes in an abstract cultural unity until its limits began to be tested. Newsprint was like a homecoming, as it repeopled the world of the migrant by populating it only with the familiar. Yet it also openly broke with these barriers by interrogating caste, nationalism, the moral rectitude of working women, and forms of elitism. I turn in conclusion to the critique of Konkani from the perspective of transcription and translation studies, which repeatedly spoke of the language in terms of a deficit. In the 19th century, the Catholic elite spoke of Konkani as a language in need of both resuscitation and reform. Thus, the moment when Konkani was represented as though it was in decline by the elite was in fact the moment it acquired a diverse life in popular print. For instance, if I go back to this, a book of Portuguese and Konkani songs entitled Ramalhatinho in the mid-19th century represented Konkani songs, but not the Portuguese ones, as those that were likely to disappear, just as Konkani simultaneously began to appear in popular print in the form of vocabularies and dictionaries. So it was very clear that it was in the lives of the elite that the Konkani songs were about to disappear. In Portuguese literary writing, Konkani appeared as an eruption of the colloquial within formal speech, or as a parallel language of political commentary. At the end of the century, in the satire Jacob e Dulce, Konkani was the earthy primary language into which the insufficiently educated elite slipped with their inadequate grasp of Portuguese. It represented the world of bawdy witticisms that reveal the underbelly of polite society. The novel appeared in 1896 at approximately the same time as Konkani was being valorized by upper castes as a primal poetic reserve of folk culture. The language was therefore configured differently in each linguistic context. Through the 20th century, commentaries favored the production of an official language in the Devnagari script, which fit the conception of an indigenous language, and was seen as a way to salvage past and future literature. Representations were polarized, as by this time the Roman script was identified solely with Catholics. Thus, the transcription of texts from the Roman to another script was received as though it were for another linguistic community and warranted being treated as a translation, as I do in the book. The difference between these views on Konkani and the prior concept of habitus is striking if we consider two perspectives on naming the language. A literary historian who was in favor of Marathi as the official language of Goa wrote an entire book on the print history of Goa without using the term Konkani. Instead, he used the phrase the Brahmin dialect, first employed by a Jesuit in the 17th century who had composed a text in it. For the supporter of Marathi, Konkani was no more than a dialect, a language that should never have been named. In contrast, its speakers also often did not name it, but used the term Amchi Bhash, literally our speech or language, often the only term used to denote it. The history of Konkani, or the nature of its encounter with statist modernity, lies in the gap between not needing to be named by its speakers to a refusal to name it by its opponents. Perhaps we can see this relationship where language is not named as a sign that the habitus persisted for the community, enclosing it, limiting it, but also creating avenues through which new experiences could be reached. The experience of writing the book about this question revealed that it is almost impossible to tell a linear history of the language, as it deviates from so many of the unspoken expectations of literary history. The Roman script was one of the 5 scripts in which it was written across the western coast of India. It did not have a unified territory and was spoken in small regions along the Konkan. It became a political symbol for one particular caste, the Saraswat Brahmins, who used it to consolidate their dominance, even while the much criticized popular literature developed in the same language. Colonization by the Portuguese meant that aside from extensive use by missionaries, the language of administration, of elite expression, and of intellectual discourse was Portuguese, as is the case in most of its other colonial territories. Unlike mainland India, therefore, a bilingual intellectual sphere with all its expected social and material developments could not be found in Goa. Instead, elites used Portuguese and Marathi respectively for literary and political representation, while Konkani print had a distinctly non-elite character, until it was adopted as an object in need of improvement and as a way to assert caste distinction. There were 3 immediate political triggers that propelled Konkani into becoming a language of state. One was the result of a popular referendum in its favor. The second was the campaign by a literati to modernize the language to make it suitable for intellectual advancement. And the third, which I've already mentioned, a caste self-narrative that lent it the intellectual and political weight of powerful figures. If in the first 3/4 of the 20th century, Konkani was a language without a state, Devnagari as its script had scarcely any readership, Devnagari as the approved script. A quote from a prominent writer suggests that in 1945, there were only 10 or 15 books in Devnagari and 1,000 books in the Roman script. When the language received official recognition in 1987 and then in 1992, only the Devnagari script was recognized, as is the case today. The appearance of a translated/transcribed text in Devnagari in the mid-20th century was therefore received as the point of arrival for a language, a text, and for its readers. And I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rochelle.
Yeah.
Please leave questions for Rochelle in the chat box. And if you would like to use the reactions button and raise your hand and ask her a question, please go ahead and do that as well. Just to get us started, Rochelle, can you, 2 questions really, which have to do with the form of the book, the way it's taken, because that's somewhat missed in a, in a talk or just, the excerpts, because people don't see, the physical book. You refer to it in an interview as an anthology. So could you give your listeners a sense of what editorial choices you've used. It's not a monograph in a way. It's an interesting hybrid sort of form. So if you could just talk us through what it looks like in a way.
This was initially intended as a Sahitya Academy project, but then that didn't materialize. A minor reason why it didn't materialize was that, of course, the Sahitya Academy does not publish anything that's not in the official schedule. And since only the Devnagari script is recognized, it refused to publish anything that was in a script other than Devnagari. Right. And so the script issue has a fairly volatile history in Goa and in other regions. So I was quite clear that I wanted to, so it doesn't have instances of the Malayalam script because I was looking for articles about translation. And I didn't find any, but I did want to try and bring out a book written in several scripts. So, digital technology has made advances, and now there are journals and things brought out in multiple scripts in Konkani, and there's even, I forget the name, but there's a sort of script converter which allows you to insert text, and so people have also tried in various ways to overcome this issue. So the reason why I had excerpts, in between the text was the idea was to try and bring in instances of text that actually, prove the point that I was making as I was making it. So, that's why my sort of introduction is interspersed with sections from different kinds of texts, and they're in both Portuguese, in English, in Konkani, and in Konkani in a few scripts.
Could you also quickly elaborate why you didn't include Malayalam and Nusk? You said you in the introduction as well.
Right. So the thing is that the idea was not just to introduce examples of scripts, but I was looking for commentaries about translations, right? Because the idea was actually and those I could not find in. So Nusk, this is the only text that's still in the British Library, that I could find at all. And likewise with Malayalam, I wasn't able to lay my hands on a commentary about translation, which is what what the book is about. So it's not about finding exemplars of Konkani written in Malayalam, which would have been possible, but looking specifically for commentaries about translation.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? Otherwise, I'll circle back with some.
I actually have a question. Rochelle, I was really interested both in your introduction and in your talk, in the ways in which you were sort of talking about the linkages between orality and philology and sort of reconstructing linguistic history, right? And sort of the philological project. Sorry, my Siri activated on my phone randomly. I was wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit more about that, right? Because with the philological project, both in the 19th century particularly, right, is so interested in written forms of language, right? And if you're looking at sort of the work of sort of like the English philologists in the 19th century, who are writing about all these languages, that are in the territories that they're conquering in the process of empire, and they're cataloging them and they're transcribing them and transliterating them into the Roman script and being like, here's how you pronounce these words to better conquer X territory and all of that sort of stuff. But when we are talking about orality, there is this sort of weird tendency to we're always in this weird place where people are like, well, we can't recover an oral culture because it's not written down. And then you have other people who are like, well, then why are you dismissing sort of half of, why are you dismissing all these really important moments and texts and so on and so forth? So I was just wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit more about how do we reconstruct I guess, oral histories without sort of constantly privileging like written culture, if that makes sense.
Right. So that isn't, say, the focus of my work. I talked about oral culture as a way to actually talk about aspects of written texts, to say that those written texts clearly seem to draw on an oral culture and seem to extend some of its practices. And that was the way in which I kind of distinguish between texts that philology, literary philology accommodates more easily and texts that it can't accommodate. And the reasons why it's hostile to these is because they actually perpetuate these these elements and these practices from an oral culture. So what I found useful was actually just, in a way, paying attention to what texts were doing, because it's true that initially when you start out, it's we all are working with the universals of literary history. So when you find something that deviates from it, the first thing that you can say is that this deviates from it. But to be able to actually come up with categories that allow you to then recognize what are the linguistic worlds that this text is trying to recover, I think that that becomes a challenge. So for me, it was actually about recognizing an oral culture in a sphere, in a realm of writing. So whether it was kinship terms or even the way the vocabularies were organized. So the fact that they would, in a sense, reproduce or piggyback on the genre, but they would use the genre as they wanted to. They would make of it what they wanted to. So those are the reasons why I picked out those texts, because they are the beginning points of identifying these categories that then allow you to tell a different history. So the issue is, I think, that the people who pay attention to these texts which are produced in what they would call contact languages are linguists, and literary historians sort of pay attention. I'm just talking obviously in broad terms, right? So a lot has changed in writing, but if I look at just the context of the Konkani texts, it's the Indian Ocean travel, it's the, like I said, Swahili Konkani dictionaries, which in a sense are remarkable. So, as G. N. Devi sort of points out, it's in the realm of the oral, it is in the colloquial that that language moves forward, right? But because we're used to sort of hierarchizing them and subordinating them to more recognizably literary texts, we don't sort of recognize these properties. But yeah, so it's therefore in kind of identifying what does this popular vocabulary do? How does it organize words? What is its approach to another language? And so that's why I sort of talk about things like an unremarked on transition between languages, which we see in the text in Nastaliq and we see in Swahili Gujarati vocabulary as well. So those are the elements that are particular to these texts. Beyond. And I thought that is a step beyond saying this deviates or this does not fit into literary history. It gives me a category to then find, similar practices, as opposed to, just to kind of carry on for like another minute. When I did that comparative, sort of just a brief study of, who else uses the Roman script. It is to indicate that these are entirely different literary cultures. It's not as though because, the Roman script is used in another place, or because Assamese literature also deviates from the national imagination, that somehow I'm going to find a similarity between these cultural spaces. But I can possibly come up with categories that will allow me to talk about both the spaces. And one of those were sort of geographic imaginaries. Geographic literary imaginaries does allow me to talk about literary practice that doesn't fit within nationalist philology.
Great, thank you. One of our students has a question that she put in the chat.
In the chat.
And she said, I wanted to ask about the differences / similarities between a register and a language. In a multilingual society, or even in a multilingual text, to what extent can the different languages spoken / written be considered as different registers of the same quote unquote language shared by the linguistic cultural community? Or linguistic / cultural community. How does the definition of what a singular language change in multilingual societies where diglossia / heteroglossia is apparent, and different languages / registers with uneven power relationships exist.
Right. So, this question, thanks. It's, I mean, this is an excellent question. It sort of encapsulates an entire dimension of the history of Konkani, which, as is obvious, is an extremely fractured history. So if you were to, if you were to, for instance, pick up texts that are produced about, if you're looking at just Grayson's project, for instance, Konkani appears as a dialect of Marathi. Right. So I sort of found correspondence between a very prominent Goan linguist and Grayson, where the linguist sort of tells Grayson that, it's not a dialect, it's a language, but it continues to be recorded as a language. And up to the mid-20th century, Konkani continues to be considered politically, in political terms, as a dialect of Marathi. And in fact, the situation gets even more, things get a little more volatile around the time of state formation, etc. So there are, overtly political contexts that alter these relationships that you're talking about. But there are also literary contexts. So there are contexts where the state is actually commissioning dictionaries, or the state seems amenable to a representation, from those who support Konkani. And that's when you begin to have these shifts. So it would be, when you're sort of considering this question from the perspective of the history of a language that falls out of the nationalist imaginary, it becomes very apparent that you can study this language in a sense synchronically in its moment and capture that register and capture that particular relationship. But 5 or 10 years down the line, you can move down the coast and you can find the same language in a completely different relationship with another. So, and that's the sort of point I'm making about the way in which the idea of linearity and territory, they just don't fit together when we're considering languages like these. So if you're looking at Konkani speakers who are in the region of Mangalore, the relationship with Kannada and the relationship with languages that are still not recognized by the state, that configuration is very different than if you're considering, your question in the context of Goa. Okay, so in a way, the question couldn't be more pertinent, right? It's actually about saying that a lot of the questions and the categories that we have are sort of assuming a conflation between territory and language. And when you don't have that conflation, you suddenly see how difficult it is to even answer. And there is no singular answer. If I talk about 19th century Bombay, 19th century Goa, and 19th century Mangalore, I can probably come up with 3 different answers about Konkani.
Yeah, and that is, really challenges the ways in which we think about the development of languages and sort of thinking about periodization and language change over time. We have another audience question where, Geeta Das is asking, I'm sorry for what is probably a very ignorant question from someone who knows very little about translation studies and philology, but does contemporary philology depart from some of the assumptions you identified in the beginning, or are they still currently predominant?
So it depends on who you're talking to, I guess. So a lot of scholars have changed, and are beginning to consider these. And like Goa University itself has hosted a range of talks, and prominent linguists have been trying. So for instance, Navayati is spoken on the Western coast and is seen as an amalgam of languages that are spoken. So, they did invite people to come and give a talk. They do pay attention to newspapers that are, which is the one printed form of the Navayati language. But the question of state policy continues to remain a fractious one, purely because, the issue really is that when it comes to literary scholars, or it comes to linguists, their approach to language is very different. Whereas when it comes to state policy, there is a sort of overdetermined symbolism, and language is a kind of very, very loaded symbol. So it becomes impossible to disentangle what should be a slightly practical question about, what is going to serve the needs of people in terms of education and jobs, and a question of cultural rights, cultural hierarchies, inclusiveness, etc. So language becomes the symbol that takes on the burden of all of these questions. So when it comes to state policy, it's a difficult issue, and this question persists. But yeah, there are other realms where people have tried to disentangle some of this.
Thank you, Rochelle. Vishnu had the question.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Rochelle, for this very interesting talk. There's something resonated with me because I myself worked on the 19th century language politics and language and identity. And in Eastern India, focusing largely on Orissa's literary politics of late 19th, early 20th centuries. And there is one thing which resonated with me precisely because much of the politics around language in the 19th century is actually constitutive of galvanizing of history, because history suddenly becomes the way that you look at many things, including language. The depth of history suddenly becomes a value. So there's a normative environment in which language is being talked about. And it is in that kind of effort you find people are talking about language in a very, very new kind of ways. And this new kind of way of talking about language, I would like to submit, I want to hear if you have any reaction to that, is a very dialectical kind of play. On the one hand, you bring history into what kind of history, that's a matter of debate, but at least you bring in a great deal of historical consciousness into the understanding of literature and language. At the same time, because it is conceptualized in a very nationalistic kind of register, identity register, which is territorial and so on and so forth, it also then limits itself in its form. For example, there are many texts, for example, in eastern part of India, the writers actually wrote, and they're actually shared by the speakers speaking Bengali, Odia, and Assamese and stuff like that. There was a text which is circulating in let's say pre-colonial period, but nobody claimed that author to be exclusively as their author or something like that. The nativity of the text, the nativity of who's writing and stuff like that, and those kind of things came, and of course, pretty much in India today, you would find that because of this territorial understanding of the language, you can say that's the bedrock of Indian federalism, some kind of resolution of language question in India, but that itself is a problem as well. And what you are pointing out is actually a problem that is very much evident in what is being otherwise considered as a successful Indian experiment. And Ganesh Devi and other people are saying that, look, are kind of bragging enough about resolving a language question by territorializing them and giving them some power and stuff like that, is actually also hiding a lot of stuff about language and literature and that history. So what your work is telling me, like I also do the similar kind of stuff to show that, look, all that what is being considered the nationalist register as a gain is also in another register, it is a loss. It reflects, depending on what you value, is not an unambiguous sense of victory of languages at a colonial period when people are struggling. I don't know if I'm making sense, but it is simultaneously a gain and also a loss, depending on how you look at it. But I think it's very interesting because, like, take for example, case of Orissa. Odia is a dominant language, but this is a society which has the largest population, a significant population of Adivasi.
Right.
Now, you would not find in the self-definition of Oriya's this thing that any other language would come to represent. And our kind of federal kind of imagination of our language actually keeps out a lot of these stuff by putting one state, one language, that kind of stuff. Although the Constitution tries to protect other, but it's not really the same thing when you kind of box languages within territory. and so on and so forth. So it creates its own dynamic. It is you can say partly successful, partly a failure in some sense of imagination. And I thought that's when your work is again pointing us to that direction, because the nationalistic way of reading literary stuff and literary production is itself a problem at the end of the day.
Yeah. So,
I don't know if you agree or
I'd like to clarify one thing, which is that even as literary historians, it's true that we work with universals, right? So even the ability to be able to talk about the problems with philology emerges because you have this apparatus of literary history that, lets you recognize and de-recognize certain things. So there's one thing about the discipline and through that discipline trying to come up with other sort of categories, right, to address things that it doesn't adequately examine or that it misrecognizes, right? Linguistic phenomena or literary phenomena that it misrecognizes. The other question is this idea of identity as something that the state bestows on you. And I'm not in any sense suggesting that this is a question that can be ignored or that anyone can afford to ignore it, right? So there are reasons why we need state recognition. And so inevitably we do find that, so Konkani is certainly not a minor language, but any language that doesn't have state recognition is going to go through these paces to get recognition. So this, as it turns out, and as I discovered, while I was inserting all these excerpts, the Sahitya Academy usually needs to recognize you as a literary language before the state will give you official recognition. So if you're looking at the history of Konkani, of Manipuri, and I included this excerpt by Suniti Kumar Chatterjee because he explicitly says, look, you need to have a Ramayana and Mahabharata in Devnagari. And, this is the year that the Sahitya Academy recognizes Konkani. Subsequently, the state recognizes it. Subsequently, it's included in the 8th schedule. So there is a fundamental link between the way in which the state understands literary history and the way it understands linguistic rights. And that's not something anyone can afford to ignore. But I guess what I was trying to argue was that while minor languages do have to go through these paces for state recognition, and there are attempts to make the Sahitya Academy sort of change its criteria, etc., there is a whole host of other dimensions of literary life that, as literary historians, not necessarily linked to the state, we need to sort of develop categories to examine those and, to enable us to examine those. So the 19th century, the focus on history, I don't see as a disconnected phenomenon from philology, because both of them produce this idea of continuity, of a linear past, of territory, etc. They combine to give us this sort of philological model, right? And one could say, look, this is just another neutral model, except that when you actually get into the composition of those canons for each language, you realize that they do end up being very particular, right? So things like classicism, epics, etc., it is in fact the self-narrative of upper castes everywhere. So, there's a way in which I talk about a sort of narrative comfort, and I think upper castes enjoy tremendous narrative comfort because there's no dissonance between what they hear at home and what they hear from the nation state. So there's an absolute sort of compatibility, and literary history in a sense, manifests that. But what happens to why does it not? So the idea of inclusion, when we say let's include Adivasi literatures or languages, yes, at the level of sort of state identity and state rights and budgets, you need that inclusion. But as literary historians, we know that inclusion doesn't happen unless you come up with alternate categories.
Right? Thank you. We have lots of questions in the chat box.
Yeah.
For that, Shezor
had yeah.
Yeah, so we have one question from Shezor, and then we have, I think, 2 questions in the chat. So we'll get to them after Shezor asks this question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm most interested, like even before this talk, when I went through your introduction, I'm very interested in the text of Qissa Salanbiya, and one comment which you made on the usage of the phrase Muslimin or Muslima, that's seemed more targeted in this context of how trying to almost a politics of gender inclusion in there, which I'm not sure I fully understood. If you could clarify that. And also I had some more general comments about, like, from my own experience in literacy and orality among Muslims in India. I think reading Arabic script, the Nastaliq script, is something everybody is expected to do growing up, to read the Quran, at least in the original, even though we don't understand the language, the Arabic. And in my personal experience, even though the Nastaliq script is also used similarly for Urdu, which is a language closer to what I speak at home, I could never, growing up, I never managed to read any of the Urdu books or newspapers or all these other texts which my grandparents or other people in the house could. And that is a question of something I've approached with a lot of curiosity in recent, as I've tried to start learning the Urdu script on my own. It is more difficult than the Arabic version of Nastaliq, as it has more vowel cues, which Urdu doesn't. And yeah, I'm not sure what this implies in the context of a Muslim identity. And since that's a more general question, which I want to bring this to, what this ambiguity of scripts and language, how does it change our perception of this question of the politics of identity? Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really important sort of issue, I think, that particularly in the context of Goa, I'm not sure about Karnataka, but certainly it's a sort of pressing question, I think, in the context of Goa. So to clarify, I was relying on the South Asia curator's translation of that section. So I guess if you don't find it convincing, perhaps, I mean, I don't have anything to say about it, but that was her reading of that section. So the reason, one is, this is the only text, as I sort of said, that signals a sort of Islamic culture in Konkani that I've come across. I did send photographs of the text, so it's still only in the British Library. I haven't seen it anywhere else, and people confirmed that this was in Navayati, right? So what was of interest to me was, just from the catalog entry, it talked about Sindhi usages or Sindhi characters, right? Which suggested, and the curator, when she sort of clarified that there were all these different usages in the text, right? It suggested to me a sort of sphere of devotional print and of the circulation of devotional text. So something that's printed in Bombay that has Sindhi usages, that's in this particular Nusk typeface, that's very clearly meant for a kind of lay circulation. It pointed to a kind of geographic territory, but it also pointed to this realm of publishing and printing, where the distinction between one language and another, or the demarcation, was not of great importance. So the purity of language, or that it had to be singular, was not of great significance. And for me, it sort of posed the challenge, because it's like saying, I cannot think of a category within a conventional literary history that can accommodate this text, right? So while one knows of the existence of Konkani Muslims, in, say, any literary history of Konkani, it'll be, you'll be hard pressed to find any mention of that. So the fact that there was this one text, right, and that just the catalog entry itself posed a challenge to any literary historical categorization, was what I was interested in. So in fact, in the book, I kind of begin with saying, why is this absent from literary history? It's not merely the fact that there's just one instance, of a Konkani text written in this script. It's also because most of what I expect of a literary history, or most of the categories, cannot accommodate it. Right. So even if I had 5 or 10 or 20, it would be difficult for me to accommodate this within a linear conventional literary history. Just as it is difficult to accommodate the vocabulary in 5 languages, right? So there's a reason why that doesn't feature in any literary history either.
Exactly.
Right.
Thank you.
So we have a couple more audience questions in the chat. So the first one was from Rajnandini Shaw, who asked, I was wondering if you've come across instances in Konkani literature in translation that speaks to cultural mobility in the contemporary social fabric.
Yes, I think translation now is, sorry, I've expanded the chat box. Yeah, I think translation now is much more attentive to these questions. So there's a lot of contemporary writing that's attentive to social mobility. I think Damodar Mauzo, who's recently sort of, won an award. His book was also about migration, etc. So I would say that translators now are a lot more attentive to literary hierarchies than they were before. I think my issue was that it's impossible to, in the contemporary, this is something we can do. But if we're looking at the 19th century or you're looking at the mid-20th century, it's impossible to disentangle a literary element from the question of script. It's as though translators were unable to, it's like the text was of the least interest to them. So a plot or what people were doing, or whether the characters were migrants or whether they were landlords, etc., was of less significance than the question of reforming the language. Whereas in the contemporary, things have changed. I think the next question was about alienation. What exactly does alienation of language mean, and what would be the difference in alienation when transcribing versus translating? Furthermore, the example of a Konkani Marathi recitation transcribed in an English script, would that have less alienation as it is a transcription? Would translation have an increased form of alienation for oral languages? Okay, so when I used the word alienation, it was to talk about the perspective of literary scholars towards Konkani. So as far as literary scholars were concerned, the fact that something was written in the Roman or the Latin script, and that it was an Indian language, even though there is no necessary, as with the alphabet and the relationship between, say, the Latin alphabet and sound with script as well, there's no intrinsic connection. Though, of course, there have been arguments made that Devnagari is more suited to the sound of Konkani, but there are counter arguments saying that it's suited to one particular dialect, etc. Okay, so that's a sort of knotted kind of question on its own. When I use the word alienation, though, it was to point to the idea of indigeneity, right? And to say that because Konkani was seen as an Indian language, the fact that it was written in the Roman script was treated as though the language had been alienated from itself, which was particularly poignant for the literary scholars of Konkani at that point, because its first appearance as a literary and a written language was via the missionaries and was in the Roman script. So it was almost as though your task as a literary historian was to rescue this language from this form, right? So that's why I say it was treated as a language that was alienated from itself. It was almost as though with the discovery of that 16th century Ramayana and Mahabharata, they somehow wanted to reach to that spoken form, right, before it had been put down by, and they could tell obviously from the way that it had been written that it was mediated by Portuguese scribes. Perhaps there were various indigenous people reciting it. Perhaps, the more and more people who study it also suggest there may have been intermediaries who wrote it down. And then very clearly, missionaries had copied it out, and it possibly became the basis for a vocabulary, right? So there's something ironical about the fact that the Ramayana and Mahabharata, which suddenly acquired this huge sort of cultural cachet, were the source texts actually for a number of other missionary produced vocabularies. So it's as though the task was a kind of excavation, right? And I talk about evacuating the language, because if you want to take away the script, you want to take away the usages that the missionaries have introduced into it, even though it is 4 centuries of the Portuguese. So it's really part of what people speak every day. It's not like some alien concept, right? So if you want to take away that, then depending on who the literary scholar is, you also want to take away Arabic and Persian, etc. So there's the search for, some authentic moment in the past, which will give you, so actually even with the Dutrina, which is the doctrinal text. So in the mid-20th century, the effort was to go back to that 16th century Dutrina, because the oral use, the circulation of the Dutrina had corrupted it, right? So even if it was a sort of Christian who was recovering the text in the Roman script, they wanted to go back to a better form of the language. So that's what I meant by this constant you're approaching the language as though it's alienated from itself. So that's the sense in which I use the term.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Just to sort of chime into what Bianca pointed out, Rochelle, in a way, what you're saying is we have to divorce the question of language from self identity and actually watch it as it moves, and not looking at multilingualism in speakers, questions of language and self. In fact, that's where we miss the heterogeneities of language. We have to divorce the question of language in the way you're looking at, and selfhood. So alienation is never in a language, but in somebody who perceives it as.
Or we have to look at different kinds of selves, which is what are the ways in which language and self coincide, which is not the nationalist self.
Totally,
right? Or it's not the literary,
Yeah, because it seems like you're also talking about, distinguishing it from, sort of state-imposed linguistic identities as well. Akila, you have a hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, it wasn't inadvertent. Thank you so much for this talk, and also for facing this implacable wall of screens and managing to infuse so much energy and passion into what you've said. Thank you so much for doing this for the Division of Literature and the Arts. My question is more for students. It's a question about methods and how should students approach texts in translation, or perhaps explore questions of translation of linguistic nationalism, given the syncretic, marvelous treasure trove of different scripts and texts that we have all over the world, and particularly in South Asia, of course, since we focus on that. Just a larger question about what would you advise undergraduate students working on a capstone to be attentive to in broadly the areas you work in? What matters most for you now, and what do you wish you had known when you were starting out?
I guess, I don't know, I would say, being really attentive to distinctions of genre. It's almost like when something doesn't comply with your expectations, it makes work really difficult and really challenging. But in a way, if one can sort of actually pay attention to what doesn't fit, that actually helps us sort of, take the discipline forward. It's a very counterintuitive and uncomfortable way of working, because obviously we're all trained, right? So even if I, just were to use a personal anecdote, so I did my master's in JNU, where I was introduced to sort of post-colonial studies, and a lot of these questions are actually emerging from there, right? Literary nationalism, why do we study what we study? And so then I just vaguely thought, because I also grew up in Bombay, so I had absolutely no knowledge of Goan history, but I had a sort of sense that maybe things didn't fit exactly. I mean, one, chronologically, I knew that independence, liberation was in 1961, or integration into India. And so but the more I began to inquire into it, I just found material and instances appearing at dates and in forms and in languages that just did not fit. And that's when I realized that even what I assumed was a sort of universal about colonialism and culture, or colonialism and literature, was about colonialism and literature in British India. So it was a real struggle unlearning that, because that was all I had, right, in a way. So the issue is really, if you stay with the things that don't fit, that actually often, will take those categories forward, right? And though I have to say, I think I spent sort of 2 or 3 years of my PhD saying this did not happen, before I found the categories that would actually make something coherent or visible, and that allowed me to tell another kind of history. So yeah, with translations, I would say, what are the assumptions underlying this text? What are the assumptions? What are the limits of its language? Right? What does it assume to be the other of this text? Would sort of be the question that I'd ask.
Thank you so much. I think we are at time right now.
Okay.
Thank you so much for spending time with us this evening and sharing your fabulous new book. I have a well-thumbed copy right now.
Oh, great. No, thank you so much again. Thank you for sort of making time and for staying through this. I know it's it's also not
It's been a very long day for us students.
Yeah,
Yes,
I can
but,
imagine. Yeah.
everybody's trying to catch up. So I really appreciate the fact that, they all turned up and they asked
Yeah.
questions. Take care, everybody. Stay safe and stay well. And we'll have more of these sessions. Rochelle, we'll have other talks lined up. So do join us when you have time.
I will.
And-
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you for
and-
organizing this and for rescheduling and for staying through.
Well, thank you for accommodating our need to reschedule. And, if you are in Literature 308 or the translation seminar that's meeting on Monday, don't forget you're supposed to be watching Arrival for Monday. So we'll be discussing that. But thank you, Rochelle, for an amazing talk. It was a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for all the questions. Thanks.